My name is Logan Hartfield, and for the greater part of my adult life, I served as a search and rescue pilot in the United States Air Force. I spent countless hours in the cockpit of specialized helicopters, racing against time to save stranded hikers, lost mountaineers, and disaster victims. Those years shaped me into someone who believes deeply in duty, cooperation, and compassion, values that can make the difference between life and death. When I decided to retire from active service, I wanted to find a quiet corner of the country where I could enjoy a calmer life. My search led me to Silver Pine Estates, a residential neighborhood nestled along the foothills of the Cascade Range. Because the region was known for picturesque snow-capped winters, it seemed ideal. There was a small local airport near the city center, and though I no longer had to report for daily flight duties, I liked being close to the hum of an airfield. What I didn't expect, what I could never have predicted, was the looming presence of the Silver Pine Homeowners Association, or simply the HOA. And within that HOA, a single figure emerged with alarming power. Her name was Marjorie Karen Tisdale. She was everything you might picture when hearing HOA Tyrant. A woman in her early 50s who seemingly had no limit to her arrogance, who believed she was always right, and who would meddle in any neighborhood issue with an overbearing sense of entitlement. The community whispered about her tactics, surprise fines, bizarre rules, intimidation, and more. But nobody dared to stand up to her. At least, that was, until she made an unimaginably reckless decision that collided with my professional expertise, and the entire neighborhood realized there was a line that even she couldn't cross without dire consequences. My partner Lillian and I arrived at Silver Pine Estates on a brisk September morning. Our new home was a comfortable single-story dwelling with dark green siding, a wraparound porch, and tall evergreen pines that lined the backyard. Birds chirped in the distance, and the mountain air smelled clean, tinted with the faint aroma of cedar. We were excited, even if a bit nervous. Suburban HOAs had their reputations, but we felt the scenic surroundings were worth the risk. Within an hour of our moving truck arriving, a black SUV rolled up. The passenger window glided down, revealing a woman with perfectly coiffed blonde hair and a pair of oversized sunglasses perched on the tip of her nose. She stepped out, smoothing her crisp beige blazer, and handed us 2 envelopes. "Good afternoon," she said, voice clipped. "I'm Marjorie Tisdale, but everyone calls me Karen. I'm the secretary and head of oversight for the Silver Pine Estates Homeowners Association. I'd like to personally welcome you to our beautiful neighborhood and, of course, advise you of some important regulations." Before we could respond, she waved the envelopes toward us. "This first one is your HOA compliance guide. It's updated every 6 months, so always check your mailbox. The second is a notice about your front lawn. I see some patches that may not meet our aesthetic standards." She pointed vaguely at the lawn, which was still half covered in moving boxes and furniture. I blinked, slightly taken aback. "Karen, we just moved in. The lawn hasn't even had time to recover from the previous owner's upkeep, or lack thereof. Could you give us some time?" She pursed her lips. "We all must adhere to the guidelines. Late compliance leads to fines. My phone number and email are listed at the bottom of each notice. Feel free to reach out if you have questions." With that, she spun on her heel and marched back to her SUV, departing as abruptly as she'd arrived. Lillian and I exchanged a look. It was our first taste of Karen's style, direct, unyielding, and more than a little insulting. We sighed, then pressed on with unloading boxes. Little did we know, that was only the beginning of Karen's meddling presence in our lives. The first weeks in Silver Pine Estates passed in relative peace. The days grew shorter. Crisp autumn air turned into something sharper. Nights got cold, and flurries of snow began drifting through the region. Having served in rescue missions all over the world, I knew well the potential dangers that winter storms could bring, especially in mountain-adjacent communities. One evening, I joined a local volunteer group that met in the town's modest fire station. Many members were off-duty firemen, park rangers, and volunteer paramedics. Because of my background, I wanted to see how I could help the community if severe weather hit. We discussed potential crisis scenarios, avalanches on the higher slopes, cars getting stranded on local highways, or heavy snow collapsing roofs. During that meeting, I learned that the local emergency response plan occasionally utilized helicopter support from a nearby search and rescue base if the roads became impassable. It reassured me that the region took winter crises seriously. Yet I was also informed that the HOA had an unusual amount of sway in local matters. My new volunteer colleagues politely cautioned me. Karen pretty much controls the conversation in any policy meeting. She's never supported expansions of rescue teams. She complains about noise, budget, or finds some reason to object. I found that baffling. After all, who would oppose a resource that could literally save lives in a blizzard? But I shrugged and tried to keep an open mind. Maybe it was just rumor or exaggeration. Besides, the mention of Karen's name left me with a twinge of annoyance. I wasn't eager to see more of her than absolutely necessary. By mid-November, I had my first real run-in with the HOA. It started with a letter pinned to our front door, an official complaint stating that our holiday decorations violated the Silver Pine aesthetic ordinance. According to the HOA guidelines, outdoor lights could only be displayed between December 1st and January 5th, and they had to meet certain standards in color coordination. The letter threatened a fine of $50 per day unless we removed our lights, which we had placed on November 25th. I was baffled. The lights were just a simple white string around our porch, hardly an eyesore or extravagance. But the HOA didn't see it that way. So I went to the association's office, a small building near the community entrance, to request some clarity. Inside, behind a pristine desk stacked with papers, sat Karen. She didn't even look up when I walked in. "I assume you're here about the complaint," she said, tapping at a keyboard. "Yes. Why is it a problem to put up holiday lights a few days early?" Karen finally raised her eyes. "The rules are meant to keep the neighborhood looking uniform and to protect property values. If we allow you to hang lights early, then your neighbor might want to put them up in October, and before you know it, we're living in chaos. Now, if you want to avoid a fine, you'll remove them immediately." I felt my hackles rise. "Do you think it's actually harming property values if a family wants to celebrate the holidays a bit early?" Her lips thinned, and she regarded me as if I'd asked a foolish question. "It's not about harm. It's about principle. We have rules, and the rules must be followed." She slid a typed letter across the desk. "Sign this acknowledgement that you understand the guidelines. Otherwise, I have to escalate this further." I took a breath, trying to remain calm. Finally, I signed the paper, determined to choose my battles carefully. As I left, an uneasy feeling gnawed at me. If Karen was this obsessed over something as minor as holiday lights, how would she respond if bigger crises arose, like the kind that demanded real neighborhood cooperation? In early December, meteorologists started warning of unusually severe winter storms headed for the Cascades. The local news channels highlighted cold fronts combining, potentially bringing heavy snowfall and frigid temperatures. I noticed that the volunteer group's chatter became more urgent. We needed to prepare for potential road closures, downed power lines, and stranded residents. The county's emergency management office advised people to stock up on supplies, ensure vehicles had chains, and review local evacuation procedures in the event of extreme blizzards. Silver Pine Estates, perched at a slightly higher elevation, was especially vulnerable. Some houses were built up winding roads that might not be plowed quickly. Accessing them could become hazardous if the snowfall piled too high. I began to wonder if the HOA had any contingency plan to handle stranded residents or to coordinate with the county rescue teams. When I asked around at the community clubhouse, I heard conflicting rumors. Some neighbors insisted that the HOA had a robust plan. Others shrugged, rolling their eyes. "Karen runs it. Good luck getting real cooperation." Oddly, official communications from the HOA were minimal. Karen sent out a flurry of emails about compliance issues, sidewalk shoveling rules, proper trash can placement in winter, even a bizarre decree about the maximum permissible height for holiday yard decorations. But there was no mention of potential emergency rescue coordination, no mention of shelter for those who might lose power. I found that disconcerting. If the storms got as bad as predicted, we needed open lines of communication and comprehensive planning. Little did I know, the real crisis was just around the corner, and it would expose the HOA's lethal incompetence under Karen's leadership. On December 15th, the first major snowstorm struck. Thick, heavy flakes blanketed the community, driven sideways by fierce winds. Temperatures plummeted. By the time dawn arrived, Silver Pine Estates lay under nearly 2 feet of snow, and the blizzard showed no signs of relenting. Roads became impassable. Several vehicles skidded into ditches. The power grid flickered. Some houses lost electricity. Local authorities declared a state of emergency in certain high-elevation areas, urging everyone to stay off the roads. In the face of these hardships, neighbors often banded together, checking on elderly residents, shoveling each other's driveways, sharing supplies, and coordinating via phone calls or text messages. I tried to get in touch with the County Rescue Center, offering my expertise as a former pilot. While no formal volunteer flights were called yet, the emergency dispatch kept my contact info. They said there was a possibility they'd request helicopter assistance if the weather conditions allowed for safe operations. In rescue work, we always weighed the risk of flying in severe storms against the risk of leaving people trapped. Sometimes you can wait for a lull in the weather. Sometimes the risk to life is too urgent. Meanwhile, I heard from a neighbor that the HOA was planning to hold a special board meeting that very afternoon, apparently to discuss excessive snow disturbances and potential new guidelines about winter decor. That sounded so absurd given the crisis at hand that I decided I had to see it for myself. The community center was half buried in snowdrifts when I arrived. Only a handful of board members and a few determined residents made it through the drifts. I trudged inside, shaking off clumps of snow, to find Karen seated at the head of a long table. She wore a perfectly pressed jacket, her hair immaculately styled, looking as if the storm beyond these walls was a minor inconvenience. Beside Karen sat 3 other board members: Edgar Browning, the HOA president, though rumors said Karen was the real power; Lucinda Miles, the treasurer; and George Reynolds, in charge of landscaping oversight. Around them were a dozen or so concerned residents, many still wearing heavy coats and boots. Their expressions ranged from weary to outraged. Karen cleared her throat. "Let us begin. This emergency meeting is called to discuss the matter of unsightly emergency equipment left outdoors by some residents: generators, snowblowers, salt bags on porches, and so forth." She glanced around with an air of condescension. "While I understand there is a snowstorm, we cannot allow Silver Pine Estates to degrade into a messy free-for-all." Murmurs of disbelief rippled through the crowd. One man raised his voice. "Mrs. Tisdale, many of us are using generators because of rolling blackouts. Without them, we'd have no heat. And the salt is to melt ice. People are slipping out there." Karen gave a dismissive wave. "If you insist on using such equipment, at least store it discreetly. I propose we pass a bylaw requiring all portable generators to be behind fences or in covered enclosures. Also, no more than 2 bags of salt can be visible on any property at once." An older woman, Ms. Dotson, stood up, cheeks flushed. "We're in the middle of a blizzard. Some folks might need more than 2 bags of salt. And how are we supposed to fence in a generator if the ground is frozen? This is preposterous." Karen's eyes narrowed. "It's essential to maintain standards. We can't appear unkempt or desperate." My blood pressure rose. I stepped forward. "Karen, with all due respect, we need a real emergency plan. Have you communicated with the county about rescue efforts? Some of our roads are blocked. Elderly folks can't reach the pharmacy for their medication. My understanding is that, if conditions permit, the county might use helicopter rescue to evacuate the most vulnerable. We should be focusing on that, not on generator aesthetics." She turned to me, her expression stony. "We do not condone private or county helicopters landing in this area unless the HOA board grants explicit permission. Such helicopters would disrupt the neighborhood. Property owners would be upset by the noise and potential property damage caused by rotor wash. In the future, if you want to bring in some helicopter, you will need a formal request submitted 30 days in advance." A stunned silence followed. I stared at her in disbelief. "You can't be serious. You're telling me that in an emergency, when minutes can mean the difference between life and death, you want a 30-day notice to land a helicopter for rescue?" Karen shrugged. "Yes, that's the regulation. Helicopters could harm our landscaping, create noise pollution, and reduce property values." Sparks of outrage crackled in the air. Residents began to shout. "That's insane. You're going to kill people with these rules. This is an emergency." Karen banged a gavel on the table, eyes flashing. "Order, please. The board will take your concerns under advisement. Now, let's proceed with the next agenda item: improper window decorations." I felt a cold fury well up inside me. I'd seen bureaucratic nonsense in my time, but never something this brazenly indifferent to human safety. Even so, I knew from years of experience, If you want to save lives, sometimes you have to move around the obstacles. If Karen was going to block rescue efforts, I'd need to find a way to act despite her meddling. Because the storm wasn't done with us yet. The blizzard raged on over the next 2 days, dumping nearly 4 feet of snow in some places. Trees bent or snapped under the weight of icy accumulations. Power lines sagged dangerously. Many roads were still unplowed due to the relentless snowfall. Reports came in of families stuck in remote corners of the development, unable to leave for food or medical care. Lillian and I made sure our house was as secure as possible. We'd installed a backup generator and had enough provisions to last. But others weren't so fortunate. I received frantic calls from some neighbors who had run out of heating oil or whose small children were running fevers. My volunteer group tried to coordinate some relief measures, dispatching snowmobiles, delivering blankets, or checking in on the sick. Then, on the 3rd night of the storm, we got word of a dire situation. An elderly couple, the Fitzpatricks, lived near the top of a steep, winding road. Mr. Fitzpatrick required oxygen therapy, and their electricity had gone out hours earlier, draining his oxygen machine battery. With the roads impassable, the only way to reach them quickly was by air. The county's rescue helicopter unit said they'd attempt an emergency flight if a lull in the wind allowed it. The pilot called me, knowing I had a background in search and rescue. We might need your expertise, or at least your guidance. However, we've just been informed by someone from the HOA that landing in the neighborhood is prohibited without prior clearance. We're not sure how to proceed. If the HOA wants to deny landing, we might not be able to do it. I clenched my jaw. That's ridiculous. This is a life-or-death emergency. Let me handle the HOA. Do not hesitate if you get a flight window. Hanging up the phone, I immediately dialed Karen. She picked up on the 3rd ring. Her voice as icy as the storm outside. Karen speaking. I forced myself to remain civil. Karen, we have an emergency. The Fitzpatricks are in urgent need of medical assistance. The county rescue pilot wants to land a helicopter near their property. We need your approval. She snorted. Logan, the bylaw states no aerial vehicles without 30 days' notice. That bylaw wasn't designed for emergency situations. Are you aware Mr. Fitzpatrick's life depends on oxygen therapy? If we can't get him out, he could die. Silence. Then she responded, cool and detached. I understand it's unfortunate, but the noise and potential damage from helicopter rotor wash are major liabilities for the HOA. We could face lawsuits from other neighbors. And, as I said before, it could harm property values. A disbelieving laugh escaped me. Property values? Karen, we're talking about a man's life. The Fitzpatricks have lived here for over a decade. Are you honestly willing to let them suffer because of a rule about helicopter noise? I'm only doing my job to protect the neighborhood, she replied. If they need medical help, perhaps an ambulance can come. An ambulance can't get up that mountain road right now. I nearly shouted. It's completely blocked. The plows are overwhelmed, and conditions are too dangerous for them. Karen let out a dismissive sigh. The Fitzpatricks should have prepared better. That's not the HOA's responsibility. I'm sorry, but my hands are tied. And with that, she hung up. I stared at the phone in stunned fury. I'd never encountered such callous disregard. In the military, we were taught that no one gets left behind. Here, an HOA bureaucrat was willing to let her neighbors freeze or suffocate over a trivial property rule. But I was determined not to let her stand in the way. There had to be a workaround. I called the pilot back. I just spoke to the HOA rep. She refused permission to land. But we can't wait for official clearance. The Fitzpatricks' lives are in danger. The pilot hesitated. Legally, if the HOA has posted signs or if they own the property around that area, we could face a civil suit for trespassing. But we also have the county's emergency authority. We might be able to override the HOA if local law enforcement backs us. I nodded, even though he couldn't see me over the phone. Let me talk to the sheriff. Meanwhile, if you see a break in the weather, be ready. I'll get you coordinates on the best place to land. I know the terrain around their house. We ended the call, and I immediately reached out to the local sheriff's office. The deputy on duty expressed frustration. He'd already tangled with the HOA's helicopter ban in past rescue attempts. Karen threatened to sue the county if we ever tried landing inside the neighborhood. The county commissioners are hesitant to fight them because they have local political influence. But given the current emergency, I can push for an override if the situation is truly life-threatening. It is, I said firmly. They need rescue tonight. The deputy sighed. All right, we'll escalate. You have my word. If the pilot can manage the flight, we'll handle the legal side. We can't let a man die over bureaucratic nonsense. Relief coursed through me. I pulled on my heavy coat, grabbed my flashlight and a set of walkie-talkies, and signaled Lillian that I was going out. Despite the near-whiteout conditions, I trudged through the snow to scope out a suitable landing zone near the Fitzpatrick's home, a flattish stretch of backyard that might be big enough to accommodate a helicopter. The wind roared, snow whipped my face, and every step felt like wading through wet concrete. But my training kicked in. I wouldn't give up. An hour later, through the howling storm, I heard the distant thrum of a helicopter. The pilot had found a small window of reduced wind gusts. Outside, my visibility was minimal, so I relied on a handheld strobe beacon that I waved overhead to guide him. The helicopter's spotlight eventually cut through the swirling snow, and a swirl of powder whipped around us as it neared the ground. The pilot skillfully maneuvered, struggling against the wind, and managed a landing on a barely adequate patch in the Fitzpatrick's yard. By then, I'd already broken down their front door, with their terrified permission, to help Mr. Fitzpatrick. We carefully loaded him, still on his portable oxygen tank, into the helicopter while his wife climbed aboard, shivering and frightened but relieved to get help. The pilot nodded at me, motioning that they were good to go. Usually, a med crew would be on board, but the severe storm had forced minimal manning. They'd rushed the couple to the hospital in the nearest large town. I stepped back, shielded my face from the rotor wash as the helicopter lifted off, and watched in tense anxiety as it rose into the swirling white sky. After a minute, its lights vanished into the darkness. My heart pounded. I'd done plenty of intense missions, but that single rescue in a suburban yard felt more harrowing than some of my old deployments. Maybe because it felt so personal. These were my neighbors, and we were defying the cruelty of an HOA official. But the Fitzpatricks were safe, for now. By morning, news of the unauthorized helicopter rescue had spread all over Silver Pine Estates. Some neighbors hailed it as heroic. Others had confusion or misguided anger, whipped up by Karen's fearmongering. She emailed a statement labeling the incident an act of reckless endangerment, accusing me and the pilot of damaging private property, scaring residents with the noise, and violating the sanctity of the community. She scheduled an emergency HOA meeting that evening to address the helicopter debacle. I showed up, determined to set the record straight. The meeting was packed, everyone wrapped in coats and scarves. The storm still raged outside, but curiosity and frustration had drawn a large crowd. Karen stood at the front, a set of typed notes before her, looking poised for battle. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, voice carrying a slight tremor of theatrical outrage. "Last night, a helicopter landed in our neighborhood without proper clearance. It disrupted the peace, likely caused damage to a yard, and possibly violated our airspace regulations. We must consider disciplinary action." I raised my hand, standing near the back. "Karen, the Fitzpatricks were in a life-threatening situation. They were evacuated for medical reasons. Would you have preferred they remain trapped and risk death?" Karen pressed her lips together. "I sympathize with their situation, but that's not relevant to our regulations. The rules are in place for a reason, to protect property values and ensure that we don't have chaos. If we allow one helicopter, what's to stop others? People might start calling in flights for trivial matters, cluttering our sky." A man in the front row burst out. "Trivial? This was an emergency. It's not like they were flying in for a pizza delivery." A wave of murmurs echoed agreement around the room. Karen glared daggers at him, then turned to me. "Additionally, I've received noise complaints. Residents claim the helicopter flight was loud, disruptive, and caused them sleeplessness. We must hold you accountable." I stepped forward, anger burning in my chest. "Mrs. Tisdale, do you even care that the Fitzpatricks might have died? A good portion of this community is also struggling with the storm. Do you want them to suffer for fear of a little noise or landscaping damage?" At that moment, the HOA president, Edgar Browning, cleared his throat. He looked nervous. "Karen, maybe we should reconsider. The neighbors are upset. The rules about helicopter restrictions might need an exception for medical emergencies." Karen's voice rose. "We do not make special exceptions lightly. The whole purpose of an HOA is to maintain order. Letting emergency vehicles, especially loud aircraft, Come and go will open the floodgates. This is my final word. The crowd erupted, half outraged, half incredulous. A few supporters of Karen tried to claim the rescue was illegal trespassing. Others argued for compassion and sense. Through it all, Karen remained unmoved, insisting that HOA guidelines must stand. I left the meeting with a churning mix of disappointment and determination. The conflict between human decency and bureaucratic tyranny was out in the open, and I suspected things were only going to escalate, especially with more storms on the horizon. 2 days later, a second, even harsher storm front moved in. Snowdrifts piled to record heights. The county declared a full-scale state of emergency. Schools converted into temporary shelters for those who lost power entirely. Road closures multiplied by the hour. With each passing minute, the danger to vulnerable residents grew. Meanwhile, Karen and her allies on the HOA board doubled down on their stance. They threatened to fine anyone who assisted with non-HOA-approved rescue efforts. They sent emails warning, all emergency operations must be channeled through official HOA lines, although they gave no instructions on how to actually request or receive that approval. The result: confusion and mounting resentment. Then tragedy struck. A local family, the Miguels, had a newborn who was running a dangerously high fever. Their house's heating system failed, and their vehicle was blocked by snow. They phoned 911 for help. The ambulance tried to reach them, but got stuck. Dispatch requested helicopter assistance. When the rescue team attempted to coordinate a landing within Silver Pine Estates, they once again encountered HOA pushback. That was enough for me. I decided I'd had it with Karen's meddling. I drove my old pickup truck, equipped with tire chains, to the edge of the cleared main road, parked in a safe spot, then trekked on foot toward the Miguel's place, carrying medical supplies. I fought the knee-high snow, face stung by the wind. Each step was punishing, but if there was any chance to help them survive until a helicopter arrived, I had to try. About halfway there, I saw headlights cutting through the swirling white. It was Karen, in her black SUV, creeping along a partially plowed street. She spotted me and rolled down her window. "Logan, you're heading to the Miguels, aren't you? I've already informed the county that no helicopter can land here without HOA approval." I stared at her in disbelief. "Karen, their baby is sick. You can't bar emergency personnel from helping them." She glowered at me. "We can't have more unregulated aircraft or unsanctioned operations. Now turn around and go home. The HOA can handle things if it becomes truly urgent." My patience snapped. "You keep talking about what's allowed and what's not, but you're ignoring people's lives. You are obstructing rescue operations. This could lead to criminal charges if something happens to that child." Karen raised her chin defiantly. "I have the law on my side. The HOA owns these roads. They are private property. And unless the county has an explicit court order, they can't just barge in with a helicopter. If you proceed, I'll see to it that the HOA sues you for any damage or disruptions you cause." I took a step closer, the wind howling around us. "Do whatever you want, Karen, but I won't let a child die. If you try to stop me, you'll regret it more than you can imagine." She sputtered with indignation. "Are you threatening me?" "No," I said, voice tight with anger. "I'm stating a fact. If you continue to prevent medical rescue, you're risking not only a lawsuit, but criminal obstruction charges. And I will personally make sure the entire state knows what you've done." Karen's face blanched at the mention of public exposure, but she masked it with a scowl. "You have no authority here," she barked, then accelerated away, tires slipping on the icy road. The brief confrontation only fueled my resolve. I managed to reach the Miguel's house. Inside, the baby was crying weakly, flushed with fever. The parents were near panic, huddled under blankets. Their heater was out, the temperature dropping. My portable medical kit was limited, but at least I could help them keep the baby warm and provide some fever medication. Meanwhile, the county rescue helicopter was on standby, awaiting my signal for a safe landing zone. I used my phone to coordinate with the pilot, stepping outside to gauge wind speeds. The storm was vicious, but there was a short break predicted in about an hour. When the pilot realized who he was speaking to, he said, "Logan Hartfield, I've read about your rescue missions in the Air Force. You're that pilot who helped evacuate those stranded hikers in Alaska a few years back, right?" I hesitated, then admitted, "Yeah, that was me. I was just doing my job. We're all thankful for folks like you," he said. If you can guide us in for a safe landing, we'll do our best to come in. I gave him a location, a nearby soccer field that might be partially cleared and large enough for a landing zone. Then I dialed the local sheriff's office to request they secure the area from interfering HOA members. The deputy recognized my name as well. You've saved a lot of lives, Mr. Hartfield. We'll do everything we can to help. Word spread quickly. Neighbors realized that the new guy in the neighborhood was an experienced rescue pilot. Many were relieved. They saw me as an ally who could organize real solutions. Meanwhile, Karen likely realized that meddling further would backfire. But I suspected she wouldn't yield easily. Sure enough, as the helicopter made its approach to the soccer field, Karen and two of her staunchest supporters arrived in the SUV, blocking the entrance gate with their vehicle. She stepped out, waving her arms. You can't land here. This is private HOA property. A small crowd of residents, exhausted from days without proper resources, confronted her. Some demanded she move her car. Others shouted about the baby's dire condition. Karen held her ground, citing regulations and threatening to fine anyone who trespassed on the field. That's when the local sheriff's deputy arrived on a snowmobile. He parked next to the gate and calmly informed Karen, "Ma'am, in a declared state of emergency, authorized rescue personnel have the legal right to land here. You need to move your vehicle, or we'll have it towed." Karen turned red, sputtering protests about overreach and HOA sovereignty. But a group of neighbors stepped in front of the SUV, effectively cornering her. Someone was live-streaming the altercation to social media, a platform that had already been buzzing with talk of Karen's attempts to block rescue missions. I approached from the field, wearing my old Air Force flight jacket. "Karen," I said, raising my voice so onlookers could hear, "you're about to make the biggest mistake of your life if you obstruct this rescue. The entire world is watching. You can't hide behind HOA rules to endanger a child's life." Faced with the sheriff's authority and the gaze of outraged residents, Karen finally backed down. Her supporters muttered curses but pulled the SUV aside. In minutes, the helicopter descended onto the field, swirling snow around us. Medics rushed out. The baby and parents were gently transferred aboard. A cheer rose from onlookers as the helicopter took off, carrying the family to the hospital. Karen stood off to the side, fuming, aware that her reputation was in tatters. The live stream captured every second of her attempt to block the rescue and the furious backlash. Little did she know that public spectacle was only the start of her downfall. With two major incidents, the Fitzpatricks and the Miguels, under her belt, Karen's image as the HOA champion collapsed. Neighbors realized she wasn't protecting them, but endangering them. Local media outlets, starved for dramatic stories during a colossal storm, latched onto the narrative of a tyrannical HOA official refusing helicopter rescues. They interviewed me about my background, my repeated attempts to coordinate with local rescue agencies, and Karen's obstructionism. "We have official HOA documents threatening fines for life-saving rescue flights," I told a local news reporter. In my years of search and rescue experience, I've never encountered such blatant disregard for human life. The footage of Karen shouting at the crowd, demanding the helicopter not land, played on TV screens and circulated online. Outrage soared. People from across the state called Silver Pine Estates, urging the residents to stand up to the HOA. Officials began investigating whether Karen had violated any criminal statutes by interfering with emergency personnel during a declared state of emergency. Karen tried to fight back. She posted long rants on the HOA's community portal, blaming the pilot's arrogance and accusing me of grandstanding. She insisted the rescue teams had trespassed and that any negative consequences lay squarely on me. But the more she blustered, the worse it got. The community was fed up. The negative press refused to subside. The public backlash triggered closer scrutiny of the HOA. Residents started digging into financial statements. They discovered questionable expenditures, inflated invoices, and suspiciously large administrative fees that Karen had signed off on. Over the years, the HOA had collected substantial dues for community improvements that never materialized. Meanwhile, Karen's property had undergone expensive renovations. A small band of homeowners formed a committee to demand transparency. They combed through meeting minutes, found missing records, and encountered shady deals that suggested Karen might have been funneling HOA money toward her own interests. Some neighbors grew convinced that she'd restricted rescue flights partly because she feared that any emergency could bring outside investigators into the neighborhood, possibly exposing her corruption. As this committee gathered evidence, they contacted local prosecutors. A formal inquiry began. Investigators arrived, requesting bank statements, vendor receipts, and internal HOA emails. Karen tried to stonewall them, claiming executive privilege of the HOA. That only fueled suspicions further. I kept my distance from the financial side of the scandal. My main concern was ensuring that rescue efforts were never again hampered. But I couldn't help cheering a bit as events unfolded. In my mind, if Karen had defrauded the community and also endangered lives, she deserved whatever harsh justice came her way. By early January, the storms had begun to subside, though mountains of snow still towered around the neighborhood. An official meeting was convened at the town hall, a larger venue than the HOA clubhouse, because of the intense public interest. Karen was summoned to address allegations of criminal interference with emergency services, as well as possible embezzlement. It was a tense gathering. A throng of residents, reporters, and even some out-of-town onlookers packed the hall. At the front table sat the county sheriff, the local district attorney, and several city council members. Karen was escorted in by her attorney, looking visibly shaken but still wearing that air of arrogant composure. The sheriff spoke first. "Mrs. Tisdale, we have multiple testimonies and video evidence showing you actively preventing rescue helicopters from landing during severe emergencies, despite the risk to human life. Do you deny this?" Her lawyer tried to interject. "My client was merely enforcing HOA regulations." The district attorney cut him off. "HOA regulations do not supersede state law or override declared emergency provisions. We have reason to believe your actions constituted a criminal obstruction of rescue operations." Karen attempted to speak. "I was only doing my duty to uphold neighborhood standards. Besides, no one actually died." A collective gasp rippled through the audience. The insensitivity was breathtaking. A city council member glared at her. "So your defense is that because no one happened to die, it's not a crime?" Karen's face reddened, but she held her ground. "I have the right to protect homeowners from property damage, from the noise. The helicopters could have endangered children playing outside." Her words hung in the air. Everyone knew that children wouldn't be playing in waist-deep snow during a blizzard. The statement was beyond absurd. Then the district attorney produced a thick binder of financial records. "We also have substantial evidence suggesting you embezzled HOA funds to cover personal expenses. Large sums are unaccounted for. Care to explain?" Karen's lawyer asked for a recess, but the counsel pressed on. "Mrs. Tisdale, at this time, you're under investigation for misuse of funds, fraud, and obstruction of emergency services. We'll be pursuing charges. If you have any statement in your defense, now's the time." Karen's eyes flicked between the cameras, the furious crowd, and the officials. Finally, in a trembling voice, she said, "This is a witch hunt. I did what I believed was best for the neighborhood. You're all twisting it." But her defiance rang hollow. Within days, Karen's world unraveled. The district attorney filed multiple criminal charges, citing the explicit blockade of emergency vehicles and the missing HOA funds. The judge granted the prosecution's request for a high bail, citing Karen as a flight risk. She was taken into custody, handcuffed in front of the entire community. Cameras flashed, capturing her once imperious face contorted with shock and humiliation. The public's reaction was a mixture of relief and grim satisfaction. Residents who had lived under the tyranny of Karen's endless fines and ridiculous regulations felt liberated. People who had always feared speaking out against the HOA were now coming forward, sharing tales of intimidation. The new interim HOA board quickly repealed the helicopter ban and pledged full cooperation with the county's emergency services. Meanwhile, the state attorney general's office launched a parallel investigation into fraudulent HOA dealings across the region, suspecting that Karen might be part of a wider pattern. It was a sweeping crackdown, and at the center of it all stood the woman who had once reigned over Silver Pine Estates with an iron fist. The court hearings stretched on for months, but the outcome was never truly in doubt. Prosecutors had overwhelming evidence. bank transfers funneling HOA funds to Karen's personal accounts, email directives instructing security to block rescue teams, and dozens of sworn testimonies from residents describing her intimidation tactics. During the trial, I was called to testify about the helicopter rescues. I recounted the frantic calls, the dire conditions, and Karen's explicit refusal to let the helicopters land. The jury looked appalled. It didn't help Karen's case that the family she had nearly cost their lives also testified. Mr. Fitzpatrick with tears in his eyes, the Miguels cradling their now-healthy baby, describing how close they came to disaster. At the end of deliberations, the jury found Karen guilty on multiple counts: criminal obstruction of emergency services, fraud, and embezzlement. The judge pronounced a harsh sentence, referencing the outrageous disregard for human life and the cruel exploitation of her position of trust. Karen was sentenced to several years in prison, and the court ordered her personal property seized to repay the misappropriated HOA funds. She lost her home, her car, and any illusions of returning to normal life after a slap on the wrist. Silver Pine Estates breathed a collective sigh of relief. The new, restructured HOA abolished many of the draconian rules. They also wrote formal clauses allowing for immediate acceptance of any legitimate emergency services. No more interference, no more red tape. Residents felt safer, and local officials praised the community for standing up for what was right. Meanwhile, my life returned to a calmer rhythm. I resumed volunteering with the county rescue team, occasionally assisting in search and rescue operations. My neighbors, once wary of outsiders, welcomed me wholeheartedly. We formed a real sense of community, one rooted not in petty rules, but in mutual respect and cooperation. In the months that followed, the story of HOA Karen circulated far beyond our county. Online outlets relished the tale of how an overzealous HOA official tried to block rescue helicopters during a blizzard and ended up behind bars. It became a cautionary tale about power, corruption, and the resilience of good neighbors determined to do the right thing. A year passed. The memory of the storm still lingered in the worn footpaths carved by shovels and snowblowers, and in the hearts of those who nearly lost their lives. Yet Silver Pine Estates felt transformed. The community banded together to help each other rebuild, support, and move forward. The new board instituted monthly emergency preparedness events, inviting local responders to share tips on survival during storms or natural disasters. Whenever I pass by the Fitzpatrick's house, I wave at Mr. Fitzpatrick, now back on track with his oxygen, healthier than before. The Miguel's child is a bright-eyed toddler who greets me with giggles whenever I visit. Every so often, the memory of that night, with swirling snow and a frantic helicopter rescue, replays in my mind. But now, I feel relief and gratitude. And as for Karen, she sits in a state penitentiary, serving her sentence, her once influential hold on Silver Pine Estates gone forever. Her frozen assets were liquidated to reimburse the HOA and the family she'd harmed. Her former mansion was sold off. No longer does she patrol the streets, handing out petty fines or blocking ambulances. In the end, justice caught up with her in a spectacular fashion. Life goes on in our little snowy neighborhood. We still have plenty of challenges, especially in winter, but we face them together, free from Karen's tyrannical meddling. And each time I hear a helicopter's distant whir overhead, I smile, remembering that in a genuine emergency, no petty HOA dictator can keep help from those who need it most.